Welcome to Educators Podcast. Hi, my name is Swapnil. I work as an intensivist in Sydney, and today it's my honor and privilege to have a very special guest from Gold Coast. That is Professor Victoria Brazil. Now, Vic doesn't need any introduction as such. Now, just to kind of brief introduction, she is a professor of emergency medicine at Bond University and Gold Coast Hospital. She is a very renowned public speaker, simulation expert, and more importantly, she's a very humble person and very keen to help budding educators. So, Vic, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Swapnil. It's a pleasure to be here and particularly to get such a generous introduction. And as a sometime podcaster myself, it's just lovely to be on the other side of the microphone.
That's right. So today we are going to discuss about a very unique topic in medical education, that is branding. Now, Vic, you are yourself a become big brand in medical education world and the simulation world. So I want to start by asking you, like, what is branding?
Well, at risk of trying to turn it back on you and sort of ask you about my brand, because I'm not sure that I feel like that. Look, I think the concept of branding does mean different things to different people. I think, unfortunately, there are some negative connotations about this being a narcissistic pursuit, which at some level I honestly share, because I think there is that side to branding and I can see why people think that. Alternatively, I think if we think about branding as a strategy for disseminating messages and for disseminating our work and for seeking feedback on that work and ways to improve it, then of course there's a very positive side to branding. If you think about it as a way of getting yourself out there so that you can connect to others to improve the work you do and that they do, then I think that's the very best of branding. But I think as a term, it's probably inadequate. And so it probably is good that we're doing this bit of a deep dive into what we mean by the idea of having a brand or a concept about what you stand for when people find you, whether it's on online resources or face-to-face. What is it that the message is that you're sending?
So I guess I like the way that you kind of teased it out, that you can use it to your advantage to disseminate your knowledge, your expertise. I was struggling myself with this concept because, as you mentioned, it has got that negative connotation. And often as a medical educator, we think that, well, I'm already teaching my learners. I know I can teach well. Why should I go to the global arena and so that other people should know me better, I guess. So what's your thought process on this concept? Why medical educators should bother about this concept?
Yes, I think we should definitely bother, as you say. One of the things that make me really sort of disappointed is when I see people doing really brilliant work and others don't get to hear about it. And I think that about a lot of my friends engaged in research agree, many of them involved in medical education, those who do really excellent clinical work. And I think they've got all expertise, stories, and outcomes to share. But if they haven't thought hard about the strategies for how they share, whether it's through a great talk, whether it's through a great blog post, whether it's through a great written publication, then I think that's a real shame. I feel like I've been lucky enough to get some of my fairly modest messages out there, partly because of more to do with the method of communicating them. So I think why bother? Because it connects you with people, because it helps spread the messages you want, and because it does open up a wider opportunity for contribution through collaborating with others and through exposing us to career opportunities we might not have had otherwise.
So I guess that theme of connecting with people or networking with people. But I guess still it kind of takes to the next level, I guess, that whether it's not just kind of networking, but also you have to kind of create a significant weightage to your name, and that's quite a hard thing. I just wonder how you managed to become from a emergency physician in Gold Coast to Vic Brazil that everyone knows.
Again, you're being rather generous there, Swapnil, but I think I take your point. And I think this comes back to marketing and the fact that marketing has pretty bad rap. We kind of think about it as putting a shiny coat on top of whatever it is that you have. Whereas I think that's actually pretty misunderstood. Most really good marketers understand they're not selling Coke, they're quenching thirst. And I think the same thing about this, and that is that the best thing you can do for your brand is actually be good at what you do and make sure that your excellence is what you do every day, not a veneer of something that you put over the top to sell yourself. So I do think the best thing anyone can do for their brand, and I certainly do not think I've done this perfectly, but I think the best thing you can do is to decide what it is that you're about, pursue that, be keen on it, do some hard work around it, and make sure that you know what it is that you're contributing. And then I think the brand is then about how do you expand the reach of that to other people. So how do you let others know about what it is that you're doing? So to some extent, of course, there are methods by which you do that. And many people, again, are more expert than me at that, whether you decide it's through having a personal website, whether it's through writing blog posts on other famous websites like Life in the Fast Lane or Academic Life in Emergency Medicine, or whether it's through a consistent series of publications that build on each other. I think all of those things can do it. And it is a bit like speaking. You've got to think, who's my audience? What do I want to tell them? And what's the most effective way to do that?
Thank you. Now, especially in the business world, the perception is the reality. Sometimes we often see that the product is not as great, but obviously the perception built around it is that this product or this brand is pretty good. And it's all about what consumer perceive that is important rather than actual quality. For academician, as you mentioned, sometimes it's the publication is the index, and we see that the person who publishes more is well known and he or she is the brand. So what's your thoughts on that, and what are your tips in terms of creating a successful brand for an academician or a medical educator?
Yeah, I'd pick up again this idea about who's your audience for the brand that you are creating, selling, whatever. And so, for instance, if your audience is that of other researchers, then clearly probably the best way to sell your brand is to make sure you have high impact factor journal publications. You have them listed on ResearchGate, you have them listed on academia.edu, and that you maybe use social media to amplify those publications. If, and I put myself more in this category, you feel like your audience are fellow educators trying to think about how best to match their methods to their learning objectives or their quality improvement outcomes, then I guess I take a slightly different view. Yes, there might be room for some publications in there, and that's a good thing. But there might also be just ways of disseminating practice that you've done that is useful, lessons that you've learned through mistakes you've made. And that might be a combination of social media blog posts, of talks that you give at conferences, workshops that you do at conferences and seminars. It might be through simply making connections and doing joint projects with other people, and then getting to share the ideas that you learn in that context with others as well. It might be that you think, well, I need an electronic portfolio, so I'm going to build my own website. It might be that when I do publish something, I'm going to amplify it through social media and say I've got really great alt metrics. So I think the thing, like most things, it's not about how you do it until you've decided why you're doing it and who you're doing it for.
I think you answered my next question partially. How can someone figure out their own brand? But I just want to dive a bit deeper, because you mentioned about that you need to be good at something. Is it always that whether you need to be perfect in something before you start thinking about the brand? Because nowadays I see that most of people are trying to do everything, like publication, speaking at conferences, websites, blog posts, social media. Do you have to start doing in order to build a kind of one niche brand, or do you think that go into the niche area first and then build a brand?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, the way you phrase that suggests that it is intentional rather than accidental. And I think for most people, it's a combination of both of those things. I think your online presence is worth proactively managing. So I guess that's taking one aspect of the concept of branding, and that is what is your online presence. I certainly haven't been proactive about how I've done that, but have been sort of fortunate to be associated with a few people who are very proactive, like Smack, like other blog posts, like Simulcast, where to some extent someone else has done some of the hard work about how that visible online presence is managed, and I've just managed to skate along on the back of it. But I think the clever people that I see doing this, in fact, have been quite intentional about how they manage their online image and presence. And I actually think that's quite important, because if instead your Google search is full of stuff that isn't really as relevant or isn't the best foot forward, then that's a bit of a shame if you are looking for ideal job, if you are looking for to be on a committee or in a position where you're going to have an influence. It's really good that your online presence is important and the one that you want it to be. But at the same time, I think there is lots of ways of doing this, and not all of it is just about the online presence. So I'm not sure if that entirely answers your question, but hopefully it's helpful in some ways.
Yeah, so I think it's not necessary that you have to be perfect at something before you start thinking about the concept of branding. I guess probably you can start thinking earlier, and then as you go, you can find your niche area and then kind of develop your brand in that area.
Yeah, I think that's probably right, and it probably invites a more general conversation about how niche should our interests be, and I think that's very hard. It depends. Obviously, many of us are in favor of the idea of having some generalist skills, because I think you then can bring new perspectives to some of the more niche things that you do. Whereas at the same time, if you want to be really good at something, you've got to spend a lot of time doing it. And sometimes that unfortunately has to be to the exclusion of more general experience and expertise that you might get. And I don't know if I can answer that for anybody else. I kind of struggle with it myself about, am I going deep on, certain aspects of simulation, or do I consider myself a more broadly a health professional educator and clinician educator? But of course, the broader you are, the less that you can go deep on one particular aspect of say, simulation scholarship. So, I think that everyone's got to answer that a little bit for themselves about what they see as their opportunities, but also what they see as their kind of medium to longer term goals.
Sure. And just to kind of divert the topic a little bit, because my understanding is there can be two different brands which exist at the same time. One is the personal brand, and second is the institutional brand. Say, for example, Bond University or Harvard Massey or Stanford. So, how do you balance them, and where is this sweet spot, especially for the medical educator?
Sure. I think this is actually a good topic to talk about, because this is one of the things that invites caution. I think your personal brand you can take total responsibility for, and that's a lot about finding ways to promote your messages, your achievements in some situations, depending on why you're doing this, or your potential contributions that you could make to others who might like to collaborate with you. I think your institutional brand, as individuals, we just have to be fairly careful that we align with it. Unless we've got a dedicated role in designing it, I think we've got to be quite careful about what we claim as our opinion versus institutional opinion. And while we've certainly moved a long way from the more paranoid phase that a lot of organizations went through 10 or 15 years ago, I still think we have to be a little bit careful about what we are seen to be endorsing on behalf of ourselves versus on the part of our institutions. That said, I think we should be looking at what is our institutional brand, and can we work with that and be part of that, because when it comes down to it, if you're working for someone, that's part of the deal. But I think it also just invites a little bit of the caution about making sure that we're not being misconstrued or being seen to send a message that might not reflect well on our organizations.
And obviously, you kind of achieve that balance quite nicely. But I guess sometimes there is a risk that the institutional brand can overshadow your personal brand, or sometimes the personal brand can become larger than the institute kind of thing. And I think that's kind of a risk not having the proportion between these two things?
Look, I think that is a risk, but it depends a little bit on where you see yourself versus your enterprise. So I'll take the example of, say, Victoria Brazil versus Simulcast. And I personally think a lot of what I do with my collaborators in Simulcast, actually, that's the message I want. And that is, what is Jesse Spur and Ben Simon and Victoria Brazil doing together? And to my mind, that's the more important message than the brand that is anything to do with me personally. And I guess it's easy when you've got a small group of people like that to have a collective view about institutional brand. But whereas, say, for my employers, Bond University and Queensland Health, I wouldn't seek to ever speak for them because that's not my role. But at the same time, I would like to think that I support the messages that they're trying to send, whether it's about messages to patients or the community via Gold Coast Health, or whether it's aligned with what Bond University is trying to do. Like, I actually think that's quite an important thing. And if you're not prepared to stand up for your institutional brand, you've got to be a little bit to think about why you're working for them.
That's right. Now, one thing about the branding is obviously it takes a lot of time to kind of build your own brand. But also the next thing is to sell your brand so the people can actually recognize that you are a good brand and you are a reliable brand. What's your advice on that, and how can someone achieve that?
Yeah, well, I guess I'd go back to what we were saying right at the beginning, which is I'm not sure that you can, I'm going to use a bit of Australian colloquialism here, I'm not sure that you can polish a turd. I think that at its substance, what you do has to be good. And that is the best thing you can possibly do for disseminating a message or for sharing ideas. They have to be good ideas. The message has to be important. It has to be meaningful to the people that are listening to it. I don't think you can put it in a shiny titanium box and say, there you go, it looks really fantastic, you'll love it. So I guess I'm not keen on the distinction that you're asking about here. I think unless you sort of saying the more, as I think about it, negative side of it, which is sort of narcissistic self-promotion, then I don't think there should be a distinction between selling your brand and having a thing that you want to share. That said, I know we're all going to draw different lines around and different descriptions around simply situating yourself and get your name out there versus what other people might call exactly the same activity, narcissistic self-promotion. So I'm not going to pretend that I have all the answers to that. I think there's also slight cultural differences. Like, I think certainly in Australia, we don't like the idea about self-promotion. I think whereas in other parts of the world, I think people are more enthusiastic about just a sort of more direct approach. Here's what I am, here's what I do, and I'm not shy about saying that. And I certainly don't think those people are necessarily, not as morally appropriate. I just think there are sometimes some differences about the expectations about how we promote ourselves.
And that's true. That's true. One of the things that I'm still struggling to understand that how do you measure the success of any brand, for example, especially in the medical education world. Now, say for example, in intensive care research world, if you publish one article in NEJM, you achieve that kind of success. And in medical education world, I'm kind of seeing now that Twitter follower is one of the kind of index, or if you publish in academic medicine, that's your kind of success. And people take this pride in having 20,000 followers or 25,000 followers. What's your thoughts on that?
I'm trying not to offend anyone here, but I think if you're ever thinking about the number of your Twitter followers as a success in life, then it's a pretty sad day. Well, I think it's a really fundamental question, Swapnil, and that is, what are the measures of success in your career? And I don't think anyone else can really answer that for you. For some people, it is achieving certain positions. For others, it might be certain metrics that they've got. I don't think any of us should judge others. I know, that said, that our organisations have metrics by which we achieve promotion, by which we achieve advancement, and, organisations have to have systems like that. But personally, I think the things that matter to me don't have to matter to other people. So for me, it's about, have I got a work environment I find useful and productive? Have I got something where at the end of the day I feel like I've used the skills that I've got to good purpose? Is it that I've got something that I feel like will show for it that might have something a little more long lasting? Am I not a human being that thinks, oh, it's pretty cool to have a bunch of Twitter followers? Of course, like I'm not immune to that kind of thing. But I'd like to think I'm grown up enough to know that that's not my measure of self-worth.
No, that's true. But the moment you kind of cross the continent and then you go abroad and then you suddenly see this kind of micro competition happening there. But do you think that moving forward for the medical education field, there should be a matrix to measure the success of medical educator?
Well, look, I think some people are already doing work on that. So researchers have some metrics that are imprecise if it comes to things like H indexes. I think people like Brent Tomer and Teresa Chan have both done marvelous work on thinking about measuring social media or digital scholarship and having metrics for that. I think there are institutions who've got metrics for promotion around medical education. Again, none of these things are perfect. And I actually feel for organizations and systems that have to create a transparent way of essentially measuring people against each other in order to advance themselves. So, Swapnil, I think we're already in that situation where there are ways by which people judge us and there are ways by which we judge ourselves. Some of those we have to just join into if we want to be part of organizations and systems. But, some of those we might want to decide for ourselves as well. So I think we're already where you're describing. It's just that it often differs according to what institutions we work for and how much they like the kind of achievements that we manage to do.
Sure. And coming to the last question, moving forward, if budding educator want to dive deeper into this concept or create the brand for themselves, what's your advice?
So I think many people have written, particularly in emergency medicine, have written blogs and podcasts about personal branding, about building your own niche. And some of those come from a variety of different backgrounds and countries where there's probably different views of the kind of nuances that you and I have spoken about. I think there's also some people who've done a lovely job of having things like online portfolios. Dr. Mike Gisondi is one, Teresa Chan is one, Michelle Lin is another one. If you go and look at their personal websites, I think that gives you a little sense about how to build an online presence that you can control and that people can easily link to if you want to have a showcase of your scholarship in whatever way, shape or form that exists. I think there's also some frameworks that other people talk about, and I'm not going to remember the name of the author, but thinking about your online presence as having a home base, which might be your personal website, and then having also these outposts where maybe you write some blog posts for others' blogs, where you do a guest podcast for the Educators Podcast with Swapnil, where you do other things online that is indicative of a presence, and then that links back to your so-called home base. So I think there's a few different ways of thinking about this. And then obviously that's really focused on things like digital and online. But I think the same thing in real life with what we do, making sure that we've got the right networks and connections that we feel like are going to disseminate the messages and the collaborations that we want to have. And some of those depends a little bit on what kind of networks are relevant in your craft group or in your interest groups, and seeking out those people who are going to serve as an entree into other worlds where you can do interesting and important work.
Thanks, Vic. And if budding educator wants to get in touch with you or if they have any questions around this topic, what's the best way to contact you?
Oh, I'm very happy. If someone wants to get in contact with me on Twitter, that's very easy, at SocraticEM. That's probably the easiest way. Otherwise, if you go to the simulationpodcast.com website, we've got a contact us section in there. Very happy to chat to anyone about this topic, and more importantly, maybe refer them to others who possibly have also thought about this in some depth and who might have different ideas to me.
Thanks, Vic. It was a pleasure talking to you, and I think you answered all the questions very comprehensively. So all will learn quite a lot from this. Thanks again.
It's my pleasure, Swapnil. We'll look forward to talking again soon.